From CPRE and the CPRE Knowledge Hub, this is Research Minutes, a weekly look at new and important research in education. Today, we look at high school graduation and college enrollment in the wake of COVID-19, and a new report highlighting the pandemic's disproportionate impacts on certain student groups.
The pandemic is having differential impacts on disadvantaged students, and the pre-pandemic disparities along gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic lines are currently growing wider.
We welcome Mikyung Ryu, Research Publications Director for the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. She discusses the center's latest analysis of high school and college enrollment data and its potential implications for stakeholders across the country.
I do not think the situation will self-correct. We need to do more and better to bring back and help these students succeed in higher education.
That's right now on Research Minutes. Hello and welcome to Research Minutes. I'm Keith Heumiller, Managing Editor of the CPRE Knowledge Hub. Today, we're happy to welcome Mikyung Ryu, Research Publications Director with the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. Welcome back to the podcast, Mikyung.
Hi, Keith. It's so great to be back.
So today, we're going to be discussing the Research Center's latest High School Benchmarks report, which includes a special analysis of indicators related to the COVID-19 pandemic. To start, for those who may not be familiar, could you just walk us through what this analysis includes and the data that it relies on?
Of course. Thank you for the welcome, Keith. The high school benchmark reports are actually one of our regular annual publications. These reports track high school students for the post-secondary enrollment immediately and within a year of high school graduation, their retention and persistence rate during the first year in college, and ultimately completions within 6 years of a high school graduation. And these reports also monitor the disparities in student success outcomes across different high school characteristics, classified by different levels of poverty, income, racial, ethnic minority students of high schools, and finally, the location of high schools, urban, suburban, or rural. Our college enrollment and degree data cover nearly all degree-granting post-secondary institutions in the nation, but these high school benchmark reports are based on a smaller number of high schools that submit data on their high school graduates to us through National Student Clearinghouse Student Tracker Services. These data are not as nationally representative or comprehensive as our post-secondary data. But we heard from many people how critical it is to understand the pandemic's impact on this traditional education pipeline from high school to college. Secondary education leaders worried that because of the pandemic, students are not able to finish high school and pursue post-secondary education in a timely manner, especially those disadvantaged low-income minority students. Although the high school student data that we hold are not as complete, the data are current. So we decide to produce a special COVID-19 supplement report to analyze the immediate college-going rates for the high school graduating class of 2020. So far, we issued a preliminary report after 4 weeks into the fall semester 2020, and just recently, we update the findings in March using more complete final fall enrollment data. And these updated findings are what we are going to discuss today. The latest data cover approximately 1 million high school graduates from 3,500 high schools, and their fall enrollment in nearly 90% of all post-secondary institutions that participate in the National Student Clearinghouse. The high school sample is no more than 14% of the nation's high schools, and low-income high schools are slightly overrepresented in the sample. These high schools and colleges we study were carefully selected to estimate the pandemic's impact measured by year-over-year percent change in student enrollment numbers. We measure year-over-year rate of change between fall 2018 and fall 2019 as the pre-pandemic baseline in comparison to the rate of change between fall 2019 and fall 2020. This is the exact same method that we are using for the COVID-19 enrollment and transfer reports. So if you remember back to April and May last year, there was a huge uncertainty, no way to predict the impact of a crisis beyond many of our worst fears. And yet, there were all kinds of predictions out there based on a very few facts at all about how the pandemic would affect college enrollment. Many predictions, such as college enrollment will drop substantially, except community colleges where unemployed adults are expected to return for additional job training and education. Also, new high school graduates would take gap years. Current college students would drop out. Disruptions will cause more students to transfer, particularly four-year college students switching to a community college near home. And racial ethnic minority students would be more vulnerable during the pandemic. Interestingly, what our data has suggested so far is quite contrary to these predictions for the most part. Undergraduate enrollment drops so far are not as steep as predicted. But our data suggests it is becoming clearer the pandemic is having differential impacts on disadvantaged students, and the pre-pandemic disparities along gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic lines are currently growing wider. The reason is pandemic-related disruptions. So today, I would like to talk about these growing gaps in college enrollment for recent high school graduates.
So let's jump right into the analysis. The main headline, to me at least, seems to concern college going rates among high school graduates. What'd you learn there?
Based on sample of 35 high schools and about 900,000 high school graduates from these schools, we saw a couple of high-level trends that seem counter to what many of us have feared. First, the overall high school graduate numbers remain stable at last year's level. It suggests that high school graduation was not affected by COVID-19. Low-income and high-poverty high schools showed a small declines from last year, about 1%, whereas their more advantaged counterparts had even smaller increases in high school graduate numbers, about 0.5%. Suburban high schools continue to decline at a similar rate as before, and urban and rural schools had a small increases from the previous year. However, these slight increases or declines across different high school characteristics, those are very small. So the overall 2020 high school graduate numbers remain quite stable last year in these high schools. Second, we saw last fall 7% fewer students entered college immediately after high school. This decline is 4.5 times larger than the pre-pandemic rate. The immediate college-going rates last fall, therefore, fell to 56.5%. Prior to the pandemic, the college-going rate was around 61%, and this rate remains stable year over year. Therefore, these findings suggest that fall enrollment declines we observed last year are not related to students not finishing high schools because of the pandemic.
So the college enrollment declines that you discussed seem to be more significant among graduates of high poverty schools and schools with higher concentrations of Black and Latino students. Could you expand on that a little bit?
7% fewer students enrolling and 4 percentage point lower college going rates. Both overall decline numbers are not dramatic, but the overall numbers could create a false image of the pandemic's impact because enrollment disparities are magnified during the pandemic for high schools that primarily serve disadvantaged students. Up until the pandemic started, the immediate college enrollment numbers did not vary much year over year by different high school characteristics such as poverty, income, minority, and urbanicity. Prior to the pandemic, both high and low poverty schools were showing a small decline, but these schools grew apart last fall. Immediate college enrollment among graduates of high poverty schools fell by 4 times the low poverty high schools' decline, dropping by 11% compared to a 3% drop in low poverty schools. Low-income high schools have actually had a smaller college enrollment decline than higher income high schools, but this was reversed during the pandemic. Low-income high schools declined by 11%, and higher-income high schools dropped by 5%. For high schools where racial ethnic minority students are predominant, fall enrollment declined 9.4% compared to less than a percent decline prior to pandemic. That's almost 10 times steeper during the pandemic. But low minority schools showed half the rate of that decline. Also, regardless of high school location, fall enrollment declined more steeply during the pandemic. Urban and rural schools both fell by 7.5%, over 4 times the rate of their declines prior to the pandemic. And suburban schools declined somewhat less, 6%, as opposed to 1% drop prior to the pandemic. A troubling trend has emerged and become clearer as more data accumulated. Whether seen through the preliminary data or more final term data, the rate of decline in college enrollment is as much as 4 times steeper in low-income, high-poverty, minority prevalent high schools.
And did you find any differences in enrollment rates between community colleges and, say, public four-year universities?
Community colleges remain the worst hit sector by COVID-19. Enrollment declines are steep, and all 50 states show declines. What's more troubling about community college enrollment trend is that pandemic-related disruptions are affecting low-income students the most, who would have attended community colleges if this pandemic crisis never happened. Our data shows the community college enrollment declined the most among students of low-income high schools, but public university enrollment was stable during this pandemic among high-income high school graduates. It's evident that the level of college enrollment declines last fall correlates highly with the income level of high schools. Graduates of low-income high schools fell at considerably higher rates than their more advantaged counterparts. This income gap is most pronounced in the community college sector. Before the pandemic, low-income high school students were making greater gains in the community college sector than their higher income counterparts. At public four-year universities, on the other hand, high-income high school remained essentially the same as before the pandemic, but low-income high schools show pandemic-driven declines. So all these findings are the evidence that COVID-19 has hindered low-income students' access to post-secondary education, even at the more affordable options in the public institution sector.
Many, I would assume, may believe that these enrollment impacts are likely to sort of correct themselves as more Americans are vaccinated against COVID and we move further away from the initial onset of the pandemic. Do you think that's true, or do you believe that more action is going to be necessary to try and reverse these trends and better support those students who have been disproportionately impacted?
That is actually a really hot topic right now. Vaccination is progressing, and we hear college applications are up for the coming fall. Many gap year high school graduates would return this fall, but I do not think the situation will self-correct. Many more students would continue to fall behind. All the numbers we have published over the past 12 months make it abundantly clear. The pandemic has much larger impacts on disadvantaged high school students, as well as low-income, male, or racial ethnic minority, former and current college students that community colleges typically serve. Growing applications to selective universities and returning gap year students, those would not offer significant relief on the equity concerns that were amplified by the pandemic, especially without any serious rescue plans for community colleges and their students. We've seen fewer freshmen, fewer students transferring from four-year colleges to community colleges, more students transferring out of community colleges, and fewer adult students and students returning from stopouts. All these data spell real threat to community college enrollment. Community colleges typically serve many of the most vulnerable students, those who will need engaged support and will have the difficulty getting back on track if they stay out of college too long because of ongoing financial and health impacts of the pandemic and technological challenges. So considering long-term implications for their future earnings potential and the resulting economic and social inequities for our society, we need to do more and better to bring back and help these students succeed in higher education. These include disadvantaged high school students.
And finally, today, do you think that there are opportunities here for future research, either for the Research Center or others who are tracking the higher education impacts of the pandemic?
The Student Clearinghouse Research Center's COVID work continues to provide timely information about how the pandemic is shifting the post-secondary education enrollment and student mobility, and which students are now at greater risk. I think we can help institutions and researchers develop data-driven strategies for mitigating the pandemic's impact on the students or the community they are interested in. Obviously, some students have taken advantage of the unique education circumstances created by the pandemic than others have. For example, those who were already on university campuses before the pandemic hit us tend to continue enrollment. More students at public universities transferred in from community colleges. This may reflect some intentional and proactive student recruitment efforts by some four-year institutions. There are information sharing opportunities among institutions. Also, our data showed 36 million Americans have some college but no completion. And when they return to college, their success rate is just as high as traditional college students. That's about 25% of American adult population. But during this pandemic, there is no sign of them re-enrolling last fall or this spring. So we would like to better understand these potential student population and would like to help institutions bring these adult learners back on track. If you're interested in learning more about our research or our data that can help you do a new research on the pandemic's impact, we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, this analysis is just great work, Mikyung, and we encourage our listeners to go read the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center's full high school benchmarks report, which is available now at nscresearchcenter.org. Mikyung Ryu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Research Minutes, presented by the CPRE Knowledge Hub. For more episodes or to subscribe to the series, you can find us at researchminutes.org. To share thoughts on today's episode or to suggest a future topic, you can follow us on Twitter at CPRE Hub. That's CPRE Hub.